Now, there were some good people out there in the streets the last few nights. Not just hoodlums like they say in the newspapers.
In a scene like this, anybody can get involved.
But that's only going to make it worse. We have to maintain law and order, or we might as well be back in the jungles.
Dollars, the ghetto is a jungle, always has been. Understand? You cannot cage people like animals and not expect them to fight back someday. It has always been an army occupation here, with police badges and uniforms. Huh? You and me, a cop and a social worker, we are keepers of this goddamn zoo.
The streets have to be safe.
Safe for who? You're here to protect property, not lives.
Well, that's what it's all about, isn't it?
That line comes from the 1973 film The Spook Who Sat by the Door, but it still resonates today, as we sometimes see more outrage over property damage than human lives during the current wave of protests. So today, I'll be talking about some Black films that matter and that can provide a context for and perhaps insights into the protests we're seeing in reaction to the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. Welcome back to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. As someone who grew up in the 60s, I've seen protests before, and I'm hopeful that the current ones will produce genuine change. But I also feel like so much of the current conversation sounds painfully familiar. We're still talking about racial inequality, police brutality, and systemic racism. So I thought it might be good to frame today's protests in the context of some films that have raised these issues before in creative ways. I see film as a great educational tool. It's readily accessible, less intimidating than opening a book, and more fun than listening to a lecture. At its best, film engages you through story and character so that it appeals to you on a very emotional or visceral level. Films may not be able to change the world, but they can shine a light on problems and issues and stir discussion that can be the first steps to change. So to highlight just a few of the many Black films that matter, I'm thrilled and honored to have writer, filmmaker, and publisher David F. Walker. To highlight just a few of his works, he's written for Marvel Comics' Luke Cage and for Dynamite Entertainment's Shaft. He's also written a graphic novel on Frederick Douglass and an upcoming one on the Black Panther Party. David and I share a love for blaxploitation cinema, and if you want to dig back into the Cinema Junkie archives, look for episode 60 on blaxploitation movies. I need to take one quick break, and then I'll be back to discuss a collection of Black films that matter with David Walker. David, I always enjoy talking to you about film. We had a really fun conversation about blaxploitation cinema. And I wanted to talk to you now because I feel like with the protests that have been coming up, films can give people a really good context for what's going on and a better understanding of what these protests mean in a larger picture. So I wanted to start talking to you about some films, but before we start talking about films, I just wanted to ask you quickly about your current project that you're starting, which is really exciting, about the Black Panthers.
I've written a graphic novel about the Black Panther Party for a publisher called 10 Speed Press. I did a book for them on the life of Frederick Douglass that came out in early 2019. So in some ways, this is the follow-up to that. And this is scheduled to come out January 2021. And it's being drawn by a guy out of upstate New York named Marcus Kwame Anderson. And it's very close to being done. I just this morning, in fact, I got an email from Marcus asking for some reference images for some certain people. And this has been a huge undertaking. I finished writing the script last year, and Marcus has been drawing it for a little over a year. It's going to be about 180, 190 page book. And when we started it, it seemed like it would be a really nice thing to do to give some historical background on a misunderstood organization. And now it's taken on a new, relevancy that unfortunately that you realize that we're dealing with not some of the same issues that the Panthers were dealing with when they first formed in 66, which is 54 years ago or something like that. So it's a long time.
It's interesting to me that there haven't been really that many films that address the Black Panthers as kind of the actual centerpiece of the film. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the reason there hasn't been that many films dealing with the Black Panthers, it's pretty complex. I think part of it is that a lot of people still see them as being very controversial. And I think that it's more that they're misunderstood than controversial. And I think that it comes down to the fact that if you were to write a story, if you're writing I guess for lack of a better term, a traditional narrative of the Black Panther Party that casts them in the role of the good guys, well, then the bad guys are the United States government. The bad guys are definitely J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, but it's the Chicago Police Department, and so I think that when we're talking about a level of corruption on a governmental level, both federal, state, and municipal, that is kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it. And now it's not as mind-boggling now because we're seeing some of these things play out on the news on a daily basis. The acts of police brutality, the cover-ups that are going on, the lack of transparency. All of this was going on in the 60s and before that and since then. But I think that in terms of popular entertainment, it's difficult for a lot of people to get down with how do we show that? I don't think there's a problem with it. I would love to do it, but I honestly think that that's part of it. I think that part of the problem dealing with things like systemic racism is that it forces people to take a look at their own culpability. It's not just systemic racism, it's also sexism and homophobia and all the other forms of oppression. Once you acknowledge it, you have to look at your own culpability. And sometimes that culpability is merely inaction or apathy. And nobody wants to face that.
Well, one film that kind of addresses the idea of the Black Panthers, and a film that has been just unfairly overlooked, is The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Yep.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me.
The Spook Who Sat by the Door, the controversial best-selling novel, now becomes a shocking screen reality. The story of the first black agent in the CIA.
Whoever they select will be the best-known spy since 007.
Their first mistake was letting him in.
And let me congratulate you on being the first Negro officer in the Central Intelligence Agency.
Their worst mistake was letting him out.
You really want to mess with Whitey? I can show you how.
For 5 years, he was their token Negro.
Freeman, you people must serve.
For 5 years, he kept his cool.
Man, you just don't belong. I think you'd be happier with a mop in your hands. Like your mama.
And in return, they taught him how to spy, how to fight, how to kill. For 5 years, he was the spook who sat by the door. And then he turned gangs of ghetto kids into a highly trained guerrilla army.
We live off the land. We match technology with spontaneity and improvisation. Men against machines, brains against computers. Now, if you don't think it can work, you check out Algeria, Kenya, Korea, and Vietnam. Can you dig it?
He turned a summer riot into a revolution.
This is a film, most people may know the director, but not as a director. Ivan Dixon was very well known for being on Hogan's Heroes, and he directed this movie based on the Sam Greenlee book. And this is an absolutely fascinating film, and I wish that it could get more exposure right now because it does seem to address a lot of the stuff that's currently going on. Tell me a little bit about the film in terms of what you think makes it important.
It's a film based on, like you said, Sam Greenlee's book, and it deals with, the plot in a nutshell is about the first Black agent in the CIA. He's hired as a sort of token gesture. And after several years working for the CIA, he leaves to take a job as a social worker in Chicago. But what he's really doing is he's forming his own like Black militant army with the goal of overthrowing the US government and starting this sort of rebel army. And it's one of my favorite books of all time. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. And it some people are terrified by it. Some people are offended by this notion of this need to overthrow the government. And I think that part of what's so fascinating to me about the movie, the story in general, is that it addresses the level of frustration and anger and all these pent up feelings that a lot of Black folks have, in that no matter how hard you try, nothing really gets done. It's you see a lot of people posting stuff online now. It's like, okay, well, Martin Luther King preached nonviolence and he got killed for it, and Malcolm X preached self-defense even if it meant violence, and he got killed for it. And what do you want from us as Black folks that we have to do in order for you to realize that we want freedom, we want equality? And this movie is all about that. And there's a quote which I will mangle, of course. It's Martin Luther King has a quote that says something to the effect of, a riot is the cry of the unheard, or something like that. And that's a lot of what at its core, that's what the movie's about. The movie is about that, okay, well, you haven't given us what we've politely asked for, what's guaranteed to us supposedly in the Constitution, and now we're going to make you give it to us one way or the other. You're either going to have to kill us or you're going to have to give it to us.
Hey, old bean. And you too, baby. This is Uncle Tom, Commander-in-Chief of your Black freedom fighters in North America, bringing you the latest news from your fighting Black underground. Hang on, brothers and sisters. Liberation is near. In just a few minutes, at precisely 3 o'clock, we will demolish the lavish offices of the mayor of White Chicago. 'Cause we don't have a mayor, even if they do count our votes several times to elect him every 4 years. Remember, brothers, in spite of the lies about an assassination attempt on the mayor, which will appear in the white press, that this time we blew the mayor's office at night when he was at home to announce the beginning of our war of liberation. I dedicate this program to the National Guard, but we're fresh out of hillbilly music. And according to the press and television, the Guard spends all his time playing basketball with the kids and helping old ladies cross the street. But we know better, don't we? We know about that 14-year-old girl the trigger-happy Guardsmen shot last night, and the people they beat up, and the Black businesses they destroyed, don't we? It's almost time. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off. And the mayor's office is now air-conditioned, courtesy of the Black freedom fighters of Chicago.
And this film had some problems getting made because they weren't allowed to shoot in the actual locations that they wanted, and had to find I believe the location they went to was where there was a first Black mayor or governor who let them. I believe
it was, they shot it in Gary, Indiana.
Yeah.
It takes place primarily in Chicago. The movie was riddled with all sorts of problems and complications, both during the production and after the production. And they're the sort of things that when you hear about them, they sound almost paranoid and delusional. Like it's like, no, there's no way this can be true. There's no way that the FBI targeted this film, and there's no way that it was suppressed and kept from the public. And it's like, well, yeah, because that's what that's what we want to believe. It comes back down to why it's so difficult for some people to really engage with the history of the Black Panthers. But yeah, there's the film was targeted on a whole lot of levels, and that's part of the reason it hasn't been seen that much. It was released theatrically in 1973, and it only stayed in theaters for about 2 weeks before the distributor pulled it. The distributor at the time was United Artists, and to give an idea of how completely it was sort of buried was 100% of the rights were given back to the filmmakers, which is almost unheard of. United Artists gave the film and all of its rights back to the filmmakers, but nobody else would touch the film. Nobody else would put it out. And so it really languished in the 70s and into the 80s, and it never got a proper release on VHS. It was bootlegged for years. You could see really bad picture quality versions of it, and then there was an official DVD release probably around 2000 or something like that. But I believe that that's out of print, and so it's sort of become this elusive film that it's not as hard to find as most people think, but it's not. It's not like it's on Netflix right now. It's not like it's on Amazon streaming or anything like that. So but it's a great movie. I mean, I watch it like other people will watch, The Wizard of Oz every holiday season. I watch The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Put the film in a context in terms of when it was coming out and how audiences would react to it, because it seems like a film that a Black audience would embrace, to say like,
yeah,
it's about time someone said something like this. Whereas a white audience might create fear in them, because you're seeing these Black militants arm themselves and basically say, we've waited long enough and now we're going to actually take action.
You have just played out the American dream. Yeah. And now we're going to turn it into a nightmare.
It's interesting because, so like I said, the movie came out in 73. I believe the book was written in 70, written and published. It came out in 1970. And, this is 73 is sort of the peak year of the Blaxploitation movement. There was a lot of films coming out that were being marketed directly to a Black audience. And a lot of them had something political to say in one capacity or another, but they were also tied in. There's a lot of sex and violence and things like that. And a lot of these were films that in a lot of ways almost pacified the audience. They were sort of these revenge fantasies more than they were a call to action. And especially by 73 it had become that way. And The Spook Who Sat by the Door isn't really like those other movies. It's not, it does feel more like a call to arms than anything else.
You really want to mess with Whitey? I can show you how. I can show you how.
At the time, there's reviews of it, and part of the reason the FBI worked to suppress it was, there was always this fear of the quote unquote race war. And it was always this fear that something would instigate Black people to finally rise up and take arms and declare war against the white man. And that's been this fear, this white fear in America since before America was America, when it was still, part of the British colonies. And I think that terrifies people so much, and especially when it's placed in a context of, oh yeah, they're justified. It's interesting because people forget that if you look at, say, Star Wars is a movie about rebellion. It's a movie about a group of rebels rising up against an oppressive state and an oppressive system. And we, in some regards, we glorify the rebels, but then in other times we vilify them. It all depends on how the narrative serves our ideological needs. And I think that the fear of a movie like Spook Who Sat by the Door is it doesn't feed the needs of the power structure. It calls the power structure to task and says, yeah, we need to burn it down.
Well, it's interesting too, because a lot of the early scenes in the CIA, it really attacks the CIA for this tokenism.
Yeah.
That concludes our oral examination, and let me congratulate you on being the first Negro officer in the Central Intelligence Agency. We've programmed your aptitudes into our computer personnel system. You're to be our new top secret reproduction center section chief.
He's in the third sub-basement running the Xerox machine, and Dan Freeman, that's the character's name, he plays that part so well. He plays that docile, and Spook is a term for CIA agents. It's an old slang term, and so the title, basically is at some point Dan was moved from the copy room up to the front room of the CIA, so that when people would come in, senators and Congress people would come in, the first thing they would see is a black person, right? And so he became the spook who sat by the door. And it's just fascinating because there's things that, as he's building the army and as they're planning their attacks, there's things that he says.
Remember, a black man with a mop, tray, or broom in his hand can go damn near anywhere in this country. And a smiling black man is invisible.
Because nobody questions you if you're a janitor. And it's just fascinating because there's so many things that are said that are kind of these sort of painful truths. And one of the things that happens in the movie, and I think this is really interesting, is as the government is trying to figure out who's behind these acts of terrorism, they assume that it must be communist infiltrators, right? That it has to be the commies doing it because black people aren't organized enough, they're not smart enough to do this.
Are you working with the communists like they say? Who's behind you?
How come there gotta be somebody behind me?
Oh, come on, man, don't put me on. No. The FBI says it's the most sophisticated underground movement in the Western Hemisphere. The work of an expert.
An expertise is white man's monopoly, right, Dawes? Well, I am an expert. I spent 5 years flunking to become an expert.
This gun makes me an expert.
You're a big man with that gun and that badge. You know, Dawes, you want to have it both ways. You want a pat on your head from Whitey, and you want to love and respect your people. But you can't be with your people without betraying that badge. And you can't be a cop without betraying your people, you hypocrite.
You think nobody else feels the way you do? You think you're the only nigger with the sense of an outrage?
Well, then hit back, join us. We can use you. We got undercover people on the force.
On the force?
That's right. But
who?
Nobody with your rank. Come on, join us, Tom.
And you're using kids.
Who else am I going to involve? People like you and me? The kids are our only hope. And I got to them before they got jailed or killed or turned into Dawsons. And now they'll do anything to be free.
Who said you were free, man?
Well, Dawes, even on the wrong end of your gun, I'm a lot freer than you are.
And it recalls in '68 the Kerner Commission, which was put together by President Johnson, issued the Kerner Commission report on racial unrest in the U.S. And it essentially spelled out everything that we see happening right now today in contemporary 2020 America. The Kerner Commission's report said was going to happen. They said this in '68, and initially President Johnson discounted all of it, and he thought that it was some sort of communist ploy to, that somehow the communists were involved in this realization that America was a racially unjust nation. And so it's always, part of this what the Spook Who Sat by the Door gets at is that America will look for any sort of excuse to not have to look directly at racism and racial oppression, down to the cause of it and down to the reaction of it. It's like, we really couldn't have done this, so someone else must have done this, and your response is unwarranted, so therefore you must be being agitated by whether it's communists or someone else. And that film really touches upon things that are being said now. The movie came out in '73, so it's over 40 years old, and it's still relevant. It's there's nothing in that movie that you can't look on the news and see happening right now.
Well, I was born in 1960, so I grew up seeing a lot of the civil rights movement on the evening news every night, and it's really frustrating to see all these things that people like James Baldwin, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis said, and that you could take it right now and it perfectly describes what's going on now. And, I grew up being kind of idealistic and thinking like, yeah, the 60s is going to create some sort of change. And it's like this betrayal that no, the change, superficial change happened.
Yeah.
But the root of the problems didn't seem to. And films really remind us of this too.
They can, most definitely. And it's interesting because you're talking about, Malcolm X and Angela Davis and people in the 60s. Well, Frederick Douglass was saying stuff in the 1860s, 100 years before, that are still relevant today. It's like, oh my God. Ida B. Wells, who was one of the leading advocates for anti-lynching legislation, there's stuff that she was talking about, in the 1800s, still relevant today. I mean, lynching is still happening today. I don't care what. Some people will argue the semantics that, oh no, it's not a lynching because they didn't use a rope or whatever. And it's like, no, stop it. Anyway, so that's that.
No, it's true. I can only speak from my lifetime. So
yeah. No, but I get it.
But no, you're absolutely right.
And it's it's interesting because it's I think that most people, and you just said you're just speaking from your lifetime, most people can't even do that. Most people don't know the history of, from the year they were born forward. Like I have this theory, which is like, you should at least know the history of your country from the year you were born forward. Like that, you have to know that much. And if possible, go back 100 years before you were born. So much stuff is interconnected, but we don't like to think about it that way. And I also think that I think there's this notion that some people think history is boring, or it's like, no, it's only boring if you're not being taught properly, or you're not, you haven't found the subject matter that sort of ignites that interest. But it's there. It's so fascinating to me. And it's, as I was watching the first night of the protests in Minneapolis back in the end of May, when the part of the city started burning, and as I was watching that, the first thing that went through my head was, oh yeah, well this has happened before, and it's not surprising to me if you study just the history of America between 62 and 68. Nothing that's going on right now is a big surprise. The long hot summer of 67, which when you say that phrase, most people are like, well, what is that? And it's like, well, the long hot summer of 67 was some of the most violent and significant racial unrest in this country of the 20th century. 1919 was the only summer that was worse, and 1967 wasn't that long ago. It's I mean, you and I both know this. We both know people who were alive in 1967. It's it's not like when you see something on the news about the last surviving Civil War veteran who's 138 years old. It's like, now there's my best friend was he was alive back then. My parents were in college, all that sort of stuff. It is just not that long ago.
Well, and I recently saw The Killing Floor, which I had not seen, and because it was getting a new 4K restoration, and that was about the riots in 1919 at the Chicago stockyards. And there were moments in that film too where what they're talking about feels like it could be lifted to describe exactly what's going on today.
Some blocks near the stockyards had been burned down. A lot of folks was homeless. Somebody said colored folks done it, but that didn't make no sense. No colored man could have got close enough to set that fire. Even the police said it was white men in blackface. I guess it didn't matter, because folks was gonna think what they wanted.
There's this part of me when I see something like that, whether it's in a movie or a documentary or I read about it, there's part of me that's like, wow, this is so amazing. And then immediately it's like, oh my God, this is so pathetic.
Yeah.
It's endlessly fascinating to me. It's the boxer Jack Johnson, when he won the heavyweight title back before there was television, they would film big boxing matches, and then they would take the films across the country and they'd play them for audiences. And when Jack Johnson won the heavyweight title and beat, I can't remember the guy's name, he was the Great White Hope, he was the white contender, it was deemed so demoralizing that Congress banned fight films for years. That was thought that seeing a black man defeat a white man was so morally offensive that they banned the film. And I think people need to think about that. I think they need to understand. There's a great documentary actually about Jack Johnson and his life and his career. And if you want to understand the true extent of racism in this country, he's an interesting lens to examine it through, that's for sure.
And of course, we also have the film with James Earl Jones,
which is I like that film too, The Great White Hope. So yeah.
Now, one of the films you brought up was not one that had immediately come to mind for me. Cornbread, Earl and Me.
That's my friend Cornbread. Man, he's the greatest.
Beautiful, man. You are beautiful.
He's the best basketball player in the city, maybe even the world.
He's a man with a plan. He's got a basketball in his hand.
He's going to college. He's got offers from the pros, and everybody knows he's gonna make it, especially Earl and Me.
That's my cousin.
And I do remember this film because I remember watching it for the first time as a young teenager, and I remember it made me cry so hard.
Yeah.
Because it's such a tragic story. But talk about why you feel this film in particular kind of echoes a lot of what's going on today.
Well, it's I can't remember the exact year it came out. I think it was 74. I know it was during the blaxploitation era, and they tried to market it as something different than blaxploitation, which it was. And it's about a basketball player, a high school kid who's about to go to college to play basketball, and he's shot down by the police. He's mistaken. It's this case of mistaken identity. He's shot down by the police, and it leads to a riot, and then there's a trial, and then there's a cover-up, and it's literally every single thing that we see happening right now. You talk about, watching a movie and going, oh, wait a sec, this looks vaguely familiar. Oh, yeah, because it happened last week. I didn't see that movie. I knew of the movie when I was a kid in the 70s, but I didn't see it, and I was actually terrified to see it. In my mind, Cornbread, Earl and Me was like Jaws. It was like this, because I remember one of my cousins seeing it and her telling me about it, and it sounded so terrifying. It was a movie about the cops killing an innocent black kid. And years later, when I finally did see it, it was the one thing I remember was I saw it after Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing had come out, which has an incredibly powerful scene of unrest after the police kill Radio Raheem, the character Radio Raheem. And I remember watching Cornbread, Earl and Me and going, yeah, this is actually more intense than what happened in Do the Right Thing. Because Do the Right Thing, as much as I love that movie, is an examination of all the things that lead up to this moment, the killing of Radio Raheem and the burning down of part of a neighborhood. Whereas Cornbread, Earl and Me is like, no, it just shows like there's like if you go and watch Do the Right Thing again, which I did recently, there's all these moments, at least for me, where I was like, oh, yep, if somebody had just done something different here, we could have probably avoided what happens later, right? There's all these moments. But when you watch Cornbread, Earl and Me, it's that realization that it's like, oh no, you are just an innocent bystander who gets shot down by the police.
You killed Godfrey! He's dead! They killed him and he wasn't doing nothing!
They think they're brave shooting kids.
He was just running home and they killed him! They ain't no damn good!
Hey, quiet down! Hey, kids, keep it quiet!
You killed him!
The dirty pigs, they come
All
from
right, come on, break it up, break it up!
They killed Godfrey! He wasn't doing nothing and they killed
dog. Lousy pig.
Kitty.
Move it back. Stay clear. Hold it back.
They sure shot the hell out of
Back.
They shot Cornbread!
And then you get caught up in the system of neglect and dishonesty, and that's the thing that gets me about that movie. Is it's like it's a morality tale that is maybe more relevant than any other thing that we could possibly see right now. And the fact that it's 40 something years old just it makes it infuriating, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Well, I think that film, unlike Do the Right Thing, there's a real sense of innocence that it starts with, because
Yes.
there's nothing about it when it starts to lead you to believe where it's going to end on a certain level. So you go in and you think it's this young kid who's the hero of his neighborhood. I think he's like the first kid who's going to get out and go to college on a athletic scholarship. And he's got two young kids who idolize him. And
Yep.
I think even for a white audience like myself, you know, I was identifying with those kids. And
Yeah.
when that violence happens, it does feel like there's this complete loss of innocence in the film on, you know,
Yep.
that certain level, which, you know, Do the Right Thing is a very different kind of dynamic. It's about this kind of like pot coming to a boil where,
Yeah.
you know, and this was just like out of the blue. And I just remember when he gets shot, there's just like your stomach just
And it's you know, the movie it's a low budget film, and so there's some issues in terms of production value, but leading up to him getting shot is one of the most tense scenes or tense sequences in a movie, you know. And because you're right, it starts out and it's this really innocent film, and then as it's building up, you sort of, oh, wait a sec, I think something bad might be about to happen. You don't think it's going to be as bad as it's going to be. And it's one of those movies, every time I've watched it, I've tried to imagine what would it be like watching this in a theater for the first time, you know, when something like this has never been seen before, never been, you know, done before, represented in quite this way. And you're right, it really is, in a lot of ways, it's about the loss of innocence and seeing the world for what it can be in its ugliness. And in some ways, that's what's going on in parts of America right now. And it becomes it's an interesting time, because for some of us, it's like, oh no, yeah, I've seen this before. I get it. Whereas there's other people who are, you know, very shocked by some of the things that they've seen in the news over the last few months. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, you know, because of the pandemic, we don't have the same distractions that we would normally have. We you know, you can't turn away from coverage about the murder of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor and watch basketball, because there is no basketball, there is no baseball, there is no anything else. And so I think that in a lot of ways, America, and the problem is America has lost its innocence so many damn times over the years in one capacity or another. But I think we're also losing our innocence again, and it feels a little different this time. You know, talk to me again 10 years from now and let me know. But right now it feels a little different.
Yeah, it was interesting because here in San Diego, there was some looting and rioting that happened after a peaceful protest. And there was even one of our young reporters who was like, I'm shocked that something like this happened in sunny San Diego. And I felt like, what cultural rock have you been living under that, I mean, we're a border town at the very least, so the sense of race issues is very prominent to me. And I'm not even like somebody who watches the news, but like to me, film and art have given me like more of a context for a lot of this than watching the news, I feel like. And like, I was not surprised at all. I was like, well, like, I've seen this happen numerous times. You know, you've got 68, well, Rodney King, whatever you want to pick.
And it's interesting because I was, you know, I I've been to San Diego many times, and I think that like that city's got a crazy homeless problem, right? And the problem isn't the homeless people. The problem is that there's no homes for people and they can't afford to live, and there's no social services. But it's interesting because this year there isn't going to be the San Diego Comic Con, and I was actually thinking about this because I usually only go to San Diego once a year for Comic Con, and I was thinking, okay, so next year when I go, how bad is that city going to be in terms of we're taking a horrible economic hit. And so there's certain cities that I go to with some degree of regularity that already have serious homeless problems, where the disparity between the haves and the have-nots is already immense. And it's like, man, what's San Diego going to be like 6, 7 months from now? What's San Francisco going to be like 6, 7 months from now? New York. And it's interesting because, yeah, you talk about this reporter, and it's like, if you're shocked by anything, you're only allowed to be shocked for about 10 seconds. And then you have to go, okay, wait a sec. Nope. This all kind of makes sense. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens just because and so the key is you have to peel back the layers and examine it and go, okay, well, why is this the case? It's interesting to me because going back to the Black Panther Party book the graphic novel that I've written, there's so much police brutality in cities like Los Angeles and Oakland and the Bay Area in general, and all over the country in the 1960s. And it's sort of like, why were the police so violent? Why were the police so racist? And then you begin to understand that, oh, well, after World War II, as there was these great population shifts, as a lot of Black folks left the South, then police forces in major cities started to grow. And what they did is they recruited people from Texas, from Mississippi, from Alabama, from Louisiana. So cities like Oakland and Los Angeles, they were recruiting their cops from some of the most racist parts of the country. And it's no coincidence that countries or cities in this country in which the African American population grew exponentially also had their police forces grow exponentially, and that they were recruiting from parts of the country in which the oppression and abuse of Black people was a matter of course. And so here we are now, 60, 70 years after World War II, after post-World War II, and this is how we got here. But most people can't, they'll just go, wow, how do we get so bad that a cop could kneel on someone's neck for nearly 9 minutes and kill him? And that's the end of the questioning. They don't want to dig deep enough to look at how the systems happen. They don't want to look at, with Breonna Taylor's murder, when the police report was released, she didn't even have her gunshots weren't even listed as injuries. It was listed as none, right? And it's like, well, yeah, this has been going on for a long time. When the Chicago Police Department murdered Fred Hampton, they lied in their police reports, and the state's attorney general lied to the press. And it was only because the people in the streets said, no, this isn't true. We, again, even with George Floyd, right? People are saying, oh, well, what's different about George Floyd? There ain't nothing different, because we've been providing proof and evidence for decades of malfeasance and murder. And it always leads to right back to where we are. People asking, well, how, why? And I don't understand. And it not in my country, it's like, sorry, getting up on my soapbox.
Well, it's infuriating. I mean, I do remember that quote from James Baldwin when somebody said something like, well, you got to give it time. And this was close to when he was to his death. And he's like, how long are you asking me to wait? Like,
yes,
my lifetime, my father's lifetime, you can't keep saying wait.
Exactly. And it's difficult. It's difficult because it's every time it's so easy to go back to, I'll get in trouble for saying this with some people, but I'll say it anyway. When you look at the dynamics of people who are in an abusive relationship, a lot of times they go back to their abuser, right? They go back to their abuser because it's something they understand. And even though it's a terrible, horrible situation, they understand it. They know how to live with even the terror and the fear and the violence. And in that regard, American society is it's an abusive relationship. A lot of us are in this abusive relationship, and the thought of going someplace else and trying something different and changing is so terrifying that we just go back to our abuser. It's that concept of the devil. You can't keep doing it. You can't keep doing it, and it's at some point it has to change. I know we're going off subject a little bit about we were talking about film, but I literally had a conversation this morning with a very dear friend of mine who's dealing with you know sexual assault. She'd been assaulted, and nobody believed her for years. And the person who did it, meanwhile, had a very successful career and then went on to abuse other people, and worked for a company that you know enabled it. And we were talking, and she said, we need to change that company. And I was like, I don't know if change is enough. And she said, well, maybe we need to burn it down. And I was like, yep, because they've had every opportunity to fix it and they didn't. And even if they tried, even if they brought in the special training, sometimes the disease is so entrenched that you have to tear it down and let somebody else start another company that does it right this time. But we have to be careful not to keep going back to our abuser just because we're afraid of what the future might hold, because we're afraid of change, because change is inevitable. It happens no matter what.
And change is always scary for people.
Oh yes.
Well,
who's afraid of change? Caterpillars are afraid of change. And the reason they're afraid of change is because they really change. They they go into a cocoon and they come out a completely different thing. They come out a butterfly. I imagine that is very painful and difficult. And there's a bunch of young caterpillars hanging out wherever they hang out, going, I don't want to become a butterfly. That looks scary. And but change is inevitable.
Now, one thing I want to talk about is not a film, but a series. It's Ava DuVernay's When They See Us, which is a dramatization of what happened with what's known as the Central Park Five.
Yep.
And I have to say, I just watched this, and this is a case of 5 young African American boys who were convicted of I think they called it the Central Park jogger, who had been raped and brutalized. And it came out eventually that the boys' testimony, or the boys' confessions, were forced. And eventually they were exonerated. But I have to say, the final episode focuses on one of the boys who served the longest time and was a teenager and put into Rikers with the adult prisoners right away. I had a hard time watching just 70 minutes of his life, and to think that he had 13 years of that was just brutal. And the police and the prosecutor or the DA are still saying, like, no, they're really still guilty, even though somebody confessed. They must have just been, and talk about like not being willing to face.
That's some serious cognitive distortion right there. And I said to you, I think sent you a message. I said, yeah, you don't need to watch this. It's not gonna. It can be difficult to watch. I think it's necessary for a lot of people, but it's not. You have to be in the right frame of mind. And for me, it was very difficult to watch because for 2 reasons. One is because I actually lived in New York City at the time that this happened. I'm only a few years older than the oldest. Well, I think Corey Weiss was the oldest, who's the one you're talking about. They were all between like 13 and 16, if I remember correctly. And At the time, I was probably 18 or 19. And so I was there. I was there in the when all this was going on and it was being played out in the media. And I remember how it was being presented. And and to me, it was this sort of terrifying notion of, well, that could have been me. It's and that's the problem with something like the Central Park Five, or going back to the Scottsboro Boys, or Emmett Till, is that for black men to be accused of doing anything inappropriate with a white woman can be a death sentence. I don't know. Again, you've got me up on my soapbox. I apologize.
Well, are there any other films that you'd like to recommend that might help people, again, put what's going on today into a context? And, I was thinking of some of like maybe Melvin Van Peebles films like Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, or The Watermelon Man is an interesting one that doesn't get shown that much.
I love Watermelon Man so much. I keep telling. I've been trying to get someone to remake that for 30 something years.
Well, and explain the conceit of that film is that Godfrey Cambridge is white to begin with, and wakes up one morning black.
Yep, and Godfrey Cambridge is play as a white man. He's sort of that benign bigot. He's the one that makes jokes about racist jokes that are not that funny, but he thinks they're funny.
Okay, buddy, this is a hijack. Take this elevator to Harlem.
He thinks he's somewhat progressive, but he's not. And then one morning he wakes up and he's black. And it's about watching his life crumble. And it's a comedy. It's a very dark comedy, but I find it hilarious. But it's watching his life crumble and watching him try to adjust to being a black man in America. And the interesting thing is like, there's part of you as you're watching it, you're trying to find sympathy or empathy for him. But then it's also like, okay, well, this guy, he's only been at this for a week. It ain't that bad. It's this notion of, is becoming a black person really the worst thing that can happen to you? And at what point do you actually become black? And I think that's the powerful thing about that movie, is that it's also this examination of how that part of what it means to be black in this country is a huge part of it is determined by society. It's determined by what society's perceptions of you are, what law enforcement's perceptions of you are, what women's perceptions of you are. And so you see this guy have this thrust upon him through no choice of his own. And in part, it's the funny part is, it's a white guy who no one would want this to happen to them. And then that's the funny part. But then the tragic part is we kind of know where his life is going. We know what's part of what's going to happen to him. And I keep, like I said, I would love to see a remake of that. I think it's a perfect time. In fact, after we finish this up, I might call my agents and see. So see if I can get a gig writing it or something, producing it.
Well, that would be great. And it's interesting, too, that the studio wanted him to shoot a different ending in which the guy wakes up from the nightmare, quote unquote, of being black to be white again. And he basically refused to do it.
Yeah, no,
in a clever way.
That would have been a cop out. And because the end really is about the acceptance, it's about, it's getting into what, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, the double consciousness of blackness. And it's such a deep movie. And Van Peebles, for whatever reason, has distanced himself from it over the years. And it's been lost in the shadow of Sweet Sweetback, which actually came out after. He made Sweet Sweetback after he made Watermelon Man. And I think for its time, Watermelon Man was made in 69, 70, came out in 70. And I still think it's a pretty revolutionary movie. Yeah, it's got flaws, but what movie doesn't? But even that starts to get into issues of police brutality and That's a movie I honestly don't know what the availability of it is right now. I mean, I've got my copy. I've got it on VHS and DVD. So I might even have it on Laserdisc, but it's definitely something worth checking out. I've become a huge fan of turning people on to actually more onto documentaries that I know are really solid. And I think that Raoul Peck's I Am Not Your Negro about James Baldwin is a crucial documentary for people to watch. And this is interesting. I don't necessarily know that many Black folks that, most Black folks I know who've seen it love it because we love James Baldwin, but there's also this feeling of like, oh yeah, I didn't necessarily need to see this movie. Yeah, I knew most of this stuff. So it's sort of like the sit down with your white neighbor or your coworker or even if you're have white folks in your family, sit down with them and, hey, we're gonna watch a double feature of I'm Not Your Negro and then something lighthearted like Watermelon Man, and then have a really deep discussion about it. I think that any movie that helps to reveal the humanity of Black folks is more important, honestly, than a movie that as much as I love The Spook Who Sat by the Door, I think that there's the plight that we face of racism and violence, but all that springs from dehumanization. And so if there's a movie or a documentary or a book that helps to reassert our humanity, I'm as much in favor of that as I am of, say, and Cornbread, Earl and Me does that, but it's also it's punctuated with that violence, and you don't always need that violence to make that statement. Like, sometimes you just want to watch people having a good time, people laughing and going, oh, I didn't know this. And I think that so much entertainment and pop entertainment that deals with the Black experience in America is there's so much trauma in it that it's like there's times where I just would rather sit back and watch an episode of Murder, She Wrote than 12 Years a Slave. I don't need to see that anymore. Although Murder, She Wrote's probably a bad example because that just sort of, that turns murder into like, a weekly event of no great consequence. So maybe Friends is a better example. A show that takes place in New York City where there's almost no people of color.
Are there any other documentaries you might want to mention?
Well, there's a great documentary about the Central Park Five, actually, called the Central Park Five, and that's Sarah Burns, which is Ken Burns's daughter, did that, and then Ken Burns did a documentary about Jack Johnson, and that's an amazing documentary called It's called Unforgivable Blackness: The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson. I'm sure it's streaming somewhere. And there's a great documentary series that PBS did in the 80s called Eyes on the Prize, which is about the American civil rights movement. And it was the first season of it was like, I want to say 8 episodes or 10 episodes. And that one's pretty easy to find. Eyes on the Prize 2, which goes from like about 64 to about 70, is harder to find, but and it's in some ways it's old, dated, because this was a series done back in the 80s, and a lot of stuff has changed, but there's also so much stuff that people have forgotten. I was talking about the Kerner report and the Kerner Commission, and that's talked about in this doc. And I'm sure there's others, but those are, like, I know for a fact I Am Not Your Negro is easy to find right now, and I think that's. But I'm kind of a sucker for stuff like, there's a PBS documentary on called Slavery in the Making of America, which is always fascinating. I've watched that a bunch of times. And then they have another one on Reconstruction, which is people go, what's Reconstruction? And it's the time immediately after the American Civil War, when this country was grappling with, well, what do we do with all these Black folks that used to be enslaved? And the answer is, well, you didn't do right by them. And there's a great documentary called Reconstruction that gets into that. And there's a couple really good books, actually more than a couple really good books on that subject. And I think that that's one of those things that people just don't get. They don't get how badly, when we talk about the American Civil War, we talk about the North won the war, but they really kind of didn't. The South had the final word, and we're seeing it now. This is why all these Confederate statues are being torn down and people want to burn history textbooks, and why I had tears of joy when the Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters was burned in Virginia a couple of weeks ago. It's like, if you want to talk about a malignant force of evil in America, it's the Daughters of the Confederacy. They literally managed to rewrite the history books, and so much of where we are trapped in terms of the myth of white superiority in this country was in part facilitated by this organization that wanted to respect and honor the sanctity and the legacy of the Confederacy. The Confederacy was a rogue nation of terrorists who lost, and so I have nothing good to say about them.
Well, before we wrap up, and because you have a coffee poster right behind you as I'm talking to you, I would like to cite one kind of true blaxploitation film, and Pam Grier is a great example. And coffee is interesting. You are doing this book on the Black Panthers, and although this film is not specifically about Black Panthers, she does involve the help of some kind of militant blacks, and it shows how strong a female character is in that scenario too, which is something that is also part of the Black Panther history, is that women were a big part of that. And I just wanted to know if you'd want to say anything about Coffee.
They call her Coffee because if you jive her, she'll cream you.
This is the end of your rotten life.
Coffee, the baddest one-chick hit squad that ever hit town.
All your friends are dead. Why kill them all?
Coffee. She's got a body men would die for. And lately, a lot of them have. Coffee's black. Coffee's hot. And sometimes as sweet as sugar.
I know what you want to, and you're gonna get it.
Coffee. Always where the action is. A mean kind of super chick who don't take nothing off of nobody.
You want me to crawl? You want to spit on me and make me crawl?
See Coffee. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without a parent. Look out, Harlem. Here comes Coffee, the godmother of them all.
Well, Coffee and Foxy Brown has a great scene too, where she recruits these guys that are essentially the Panthers, and I want to do something that gets more into pop culture and blaxploitation films in a new project I'm trying to do, and that the Pam Grier stuff really touches upon it, because it even though the characters she portrayed were these hypersexualized, in a lot of ways, male fantasies of what a strong woman looks like, there were a lot of strong women in the movement, in the Black Panther Party, who did, there was just as many women training and learning how to use guns as there were men that were in the kitchens cooking for the free breakfast program. And I think that's, the history of women, Black women, and their role in not just the civil rights movement, but going all the way back to abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, all that. Like, that in and of itself is so poorly recorded, and on my list of things to work on and try to rectify, that's at the top of my list. Is like, even if, and it's not necessarily say I'm the one to do it, but we need to see more, narratives, graphic novel narratives about whether it's an Ida B. Wells or a Fannie Lou Hamer or Shirley Chisholm. There's so many women that did so much, and not just Black women, but I mean, when it comes to history, recognizing the achievements of any cross-section of humanity, I think we could all agree that women are the ones that have been left out the most. And I think that's another part of the change that we need to face. And no matter how painful or scary it might be, we need to address the oppression of women, but not just the oppression, also the massive accomplishments, starting with giving birth. Right? Like, where would we be without women? So yeah, again, that's my soapbox. It's always great talking to you because you don't, we never have dull conversations about, what's my favorite episode of the Flintstones.
Well, and for me, films really are a great way, I think, to get people to discuss issues and to kind of create empathy for other people. And they're so accessible. People aren't scared to watch a movie. Sometimes they're scared to read a book or pick it up.
Oh, yeah.
But a movie, it's pop culture, it's entertainment, and sometimes you can just slide stuff in that they might not be aware of, and it's easier to hand somebody a DVD or something and say, hey, give this a watch, and see if it has some sort of impact on them.
I agree 100%. It's also why I love comics and graphic novels so much.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that to a certain extent as well with that medium.
Well, I am looking forward to your Black Panther graphic novel, and hopefully maybe we can talk about that when it comes out.
Yeah, that'd be great. And hopefully, at some point people will be able to travel a little bit more freely and get around. I'd like to get back down to San Diego, and your city has one of my favorite libraries of any city I've been to in this country. It's just that downtown library is so, I love it there. And I've got, some really good friends in San Diego. So hopefully I get to visit everyone there sometime in the relatively near future.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. It was good talking to you. Stay safe and healthy and be well.
That was David Walker, author of the upcoming The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel, coming out in January. For links to some of these films, go to kpbs.org/cinemajunkie. Plus, if you want to see the daily Black filmmaker spotlights I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Cinebeth. That's CINEBETH. Or like my Cinema Junkie page on Facebook, where I'm also posting those highlights. I'll also be posting a companion podcast to this on Monday, with David talking more about the Black Panther Party and featuring an interview I did with San Diego Black Panther Chairman Henry Lee Wallace V, just to provide some historical context in addition to the cinematic one. Thanks for listening to another episode of Cinema Junkie. Please consider sharing the show with a friend. Till our next film fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident Cinema Junkie.